Yeah, hello and welcome to our lecture series on climate protection. First of all, I would like to invite you again to write a slogan on OLAT. I mentioned this OLAT document, which is an online document. Please just type in the document directly, so it's an online document. Yeah, just feel free. That's only for our last session. Yeah, you will see what we will make out of it. It will be some kind of art piece which is made out of the slogans. So you are kindly invited to write some slogans. Yeah, and we have a special guest today, Patrick Kupper, and he is talking about history. We can learn from history, and as you've read in the newspaper, the summer last year was warms unparalleled over the past 2,000 years. This graph is from a Nature paper from ESPA this year. But Patrick Kupper will talk today about transition. And Patrick Kupper is professor at the University of Innsbruck since 2014. He works in the Institute for History and European Ethnology within the Department of Economic and Social Environmental History. His field of research addresses the transnational economic, social, and environmental history of modern Europe, global history, history of technology and science, as well as the history of the Alps and mountain regions. Last year, he was visiting researcher at the Research Center Global Dynamics at the University of Leipzig. And on his homepage, he mentioned under project, under preparation, there was written energy history. And this keyword caught my attention as energy is strongly related to greenhouse gas emissions, and learning from history might help to make the right decisions for the future. At the moment, our whole planet is in a global crisis, and Patrick Kupper asks if this crisis is just a transition. Looking forward to his presentation of today with the title, The Current Energy and Climate Crisis in Historical Perspective. Welcome, Patrick Kupper.
Thank you very much, Rainer, for the kind introduction and also for inviting me to speak here. And good afternoon, everyone. A moment. Here in the lecture hall and also at the screens. Can you hear me here? Yeah, okay, fine. So you have just heard it. Our current energy and climate crisis are closely linked. CO2 is the largest contributor to global warming, and most CO2 is produced by burning foods. And you have already heard about this in previous lectures in this series, so I don't have to elaborate. What I would like to talk about today is how our current situation presents itself when we put it into a historical perspective. To do this, I'm asking a question in my title, and as I've hidden a little play on words in this, it's actually not one, but two questions. On the one hand, I want to ask if the transition we are heading towards will be a just one, a just transition. So, if you have already looked into international climate policy, you will probably have come across this term. For example, you find it in two of the most important documents of recent years, in the Paris Agreement of the United Nations of 2015, which is, I'm citing, taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce. And you find it also in the European Union's Green Deal of 2020, which features a just transition mechanism. As you can see, both texts emphasize the economy and jobs. And this is no coincidence. The concept of just transition comes from the trade unions. It was developed in the United States in the 1980s, when the trade unions called for compensatory measures to offset the loss of jobs in heavy industry in the so-called Rust Belt. However, such a concept of climate justice is narrow. In my opinion, too narrow. I will come back to this towards the end of my presentation. Before, I would like to discuss the second way of reading my title question. And this one becomes clear when we move the article from the beginning to the center. Then we ask, just a transition? To deal with this question, we first need to clarify what is commonly meant by the transition at hand. For this, and for once, Wikipedia is a good source. The entry for energy transition there reads, currently, a transition to sustainable energy is underway to limit climate change. As much sustainable energy is renewable, it is also known as the renewable energy transition. In German, we don't usually talk about energy transition, but about Energiewende. The Duden Dictionary has the following explanation for this. Energiewende, Ersatz der Nutzung von fossilen und atomaren Energiequellen durch eine ökologische, nachhaltige Energieversorgung. So, replacement of the use of fossil and nuclear energy sources by ecological, renewable or sustainable energy supply. As you can see, the Energiewende explicitly mentions nuclear energy beside fossil fuels. There are, again, historical reasons for this, which I will come back to in a moment. First, let's take a look at how such an energy transition or Energiewende is supposed to look like. For this purpose, I have selected a chart from our world in data, showing the development of global primary energy consumption since 1800, broken down by energy source. Now, according to our definitions, the following sources have to go. Coal, oil, and gas, and according to the Energiewende as well, nuclear. What will be left are the renewables. Hydropower, biomass, wind, solar, biofuels, and other renewables, such as geothermal energy. And now look at this picture and ask yourself, just a transition? Really? Merely a transition? So what do you have to expect for the next maybe 35 to 40 minutes? I will start briefly explaining where the two terms energy transition and Energiewende come from. Then, in a second step, I will ask to what extent we can identify energy transitions in the past and what characterized them. This will add nuance to my question by asking, can our current energy transition be categorized as part of a series of energy transitions that have already taken place? Is it just another one? Or is it different? Respectively, must it be different? We will see that several energy transitions indeed have taken place in the past 200 years, and that these transitions had certain peculiarities. And these are peculiarities, I will argue, we must, under all circumstances, get away from in our current transition. In part 3, I will then become a little more theoretical by asking what models there are that can help us to better understand the mentioned peculiarities of past energy transitions, and thus may help us to override them. This will lead us in my fourth and final step back to our current energy transition. And I will try to answer both of my questions. Will it be just another transition, or must it be a transition of a new kind? And will the transition likely be just? Now let me start with my first point, the origin of terms energy transition and Energiewende. My aim here is not to track down the first use of these two terms, but rather the moment when they entered the political arena and to see how they did so. Both terms emerged at almost the same time, in the second half of the 1970s. These years were characterized by intense and controversial debates on energy issues, fueled on the one hand by the oil price crisis of that decade, and on the other by the flourishing environmental and anti-nuclear movements. I have brought you two historical documents. The first is the televised speech by US President Jimmy Carter from 1977 on energy. And I would like to listen briefly to this. It's an 18-minute speech, but we will only listen to 2.5 minutes of it. So how do I switch now?
Now, I know that some of you may doubt that we face real energy shortages. The 1973 gas lines are gone, and with this springtime weather, our homes are warm again. But our energy problem is worse tonight than it was in 1973, or a few weeks ago in the dead of winter. It's worse because more waste has occurred, and more time has passed by without our planning for the future. And it'll get worse every day until we act. The oil and natural gas that we rely on for 75% of our energy are simply running out. In spite of increased effort, domestic production has been dropping steadily at about 6% a year. Imports have doubled in the last 5 years, and our nation's economic and political independence is becoming increasingly vulnerable. Unless profound changes are made to lower oil consumption, we now believe that early in the 1980s, the world will be demanding more oil than it can produce. The world now uses about 60 million barrels of oil a day, and demand increases each year about 5%. This means that just to stay even, we need the production of a new Texas every year, an Alaskan North Slope every 9 months, or a new Saudi Arabia every 3 years. Obviously, this cannot continue. We must look back into history to understand our energy problem. Twice in the last several hundred years, there's been a transition in the way people use energy. The first was about 200 years ago, when we changed away from wood, which had provided about 90% of all fuel, to coal, which was much more efficient. This change became the basis of the Industrial Revolution. The second change took place in this century, with the growing use of oil and natural gas. They were more convenient and cheaper than coal, and the supply seemed to be almost without limit. They made possible the age of automobile and airplane travel. Nearly everyone who is alive today grew up during this period, and we have never known anything different. Because we are now running out of gas and oil, we must prepare quickly for a third change, to strict conservation, and to the renewed use of coal, and to permanent renewable energy sources like solar power. The world is not prepared for the future. During the 1950s, people used twice as much oil as during the 1940s. During the 1960s, we used twice as much as during the 1950s. And in each of those decades,
Okay. Thanks a lot. So I hope you could understand. I'm not sure how good the quality was, but I will come back to this Carter's speech. But first, it's still running. It's away. Okay. Oh, it's completely closed. So, well, it's only 18 minutes, so it will stop at some time. So, okay. I'd like to continue. Just tell me if you cannot understand me, if there's too much noise around, so we can look into it. So, as I said, I will come back to Carter's speech, but first let's have a look at the term Energiewende. We find it in the title of a study published in 1980 by the Freiburg Öko-Institute, which had been founded 3 years earlier out of the environmental and anti-nuclear movement in Germany. The study here attempted to show how a dead energy future without oil and nuclear is possible. Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. Here you can see that the rejection of nuclear power was already written into the concept of Energiewende when it was launched. Otherwise, the statements made by Carter and the Öko-Institute are surprisingly similar. Nonetheless, the term Wende, like turnaround, evokes different associations, and transition is more like a transfer. And indeed, Jimmy Carter said that we should look into history. And of course, I like this quote. And he said, then we would see that such transitions are nothing new, but rather that the United States had already successfully gone through such transitions twice. His implicit message was, of course, we have already done it, and we can and will do it again. And this is, you see, American pragmatism and American optimism, of course. But how accurate was Carter's view of history? I have to say, not bad at all. He was slightly off the mark when dating the transition to coal. And this brings me to my second part, the historical energy transitions. And I will limit myself to the past around 250 years, which I consider to be particularly relevant for understanding our present. And I will base my analysis on a somewhat more elaborate definition of energy transition as proposed by Václav Smil. Energy transitions are characterized, and I cite, and you can also read it, as characterized by shifts in the shares of individual pools and in the origins of electricity generation, as well as the adoption and diffusion rates of new prime movers, and as new patterns of final energy users. As we will see in a moment, this somewhat complicated definition is necessary in order to be able to grasp the changes precisely, the moments of change. I would like to trace these using the global energy statistic that you are already familiar with and supplement it with a global electricity statistics on the right. From these figures, I can derive 6 transitions. The dates given here are given by me are based on Smil's specifications. They mark moments in which ongoing shifts in the proportions of the individual pools and in the origin of electricity generation can be recognized. A first transition we see around 1850, and you can follow this by looking at the graphics. The first transition we see around 1850 with the increase in coal consumption. A second around 1900 with the emergence of electricity, and the addition of electricity also complicates matters, as electricity is not a primary but a secondary energy source, as you know, and one that is created by converting a primary source. As you can see from the diagram on the right, all of the primary energy sources can and were used for this purpose. Then, from around 1920, we have crude oil, and Carter was right in dating this. From 1950, natural gas, and from 1970, nuclear energy. And it was only very recently, around 2010, that the, how it is called here, other renewables were finally added. So much for an overview. How should we now imagine how such transitions unfolded? For this, I would like to take a brief look at the first of these transitions mentioned here, which I like to call the coal transition. Jimmy Carter referred to this transition as the first great transition away from wood to coal, and he called it the basis of the Industrial Revolution, which we date at the later 18th century Great Britain. And this was also the date Jimmy Carter mentioned. And what Jimmy Carter told is also what you read in most school books and textbooks, with James Watt as the hero, the inventor of the coal-fired steam engine. You can see it on the left here, which then fueled the Industrial Revolution. And as Britain had vast coal reserves, it could now replace the scarce timber available on its already largely deforested Isles. This is, all in all, a very appealing story. But unfortunately, it's not true. Because if we ask what shaped the Industrial Revolution in its early days, in the late 18th century, it was the mechanization of the textile industry, especially the processing of cotton. For this, weaving and spinning machines, like the ones you see here on the right and in the middle, where these kind of machines were used. And the name water frame already tells you what these machines were powered by. Not by coal, but by water. If this is sometimes acknowledged, it's said, well, yeah, but coal played a decisive role in new smelting processes for the production of high-quality iron, which in turn allowed the construction of new kinds of machines. And this is correct. However, as you can see on the picture, the machines used in early textile industry were not made of iron, but almost exclusively made of wood. A further look at the British foreign trade statistics of the 19th century further undermines the story of coal replacing wood. Because the imports of wood did not diminish, as you would expect, following the storyline of replacing, but they multiplied with industrialization in the 19th century. I'm not saying that coal and the steam engine were insignificant. That would be just absurd. Of course, Britain vastly benefited from its vast coal reserves, which increasingly fed into industrial processes, and from the steam engine, which made possible new means of coal-powered transport. Sitting on a mountain of coal was lucky for 19th century United Kingdom, and perhaps unlucky for today's world. For what we are actually seeing in the process of industrialization is not that coal replaced wood, also it did in certain places, but what we see above all is that coal complemented existing energy sources. Not only wood, but also water and others. And this is the crucial point, and the reason why I am explaining this to you in such length. Because this complementation, which went far beyond replacing or substitution, was going to be repeated in all transitions thereafter. Usually, however, you get the story told differently. In past energy transition, it is said one energy source had replaced another. First, coal replaced, as we heard, first coal replaced wood, then oil replaced coal, and so on. We saw this thinking in Carter's speech. You see it also in the school books and textbooks. And we see it here in the illustration on the left of Cesare Marchetti, an influential, recently deceased system analyst. Published it in 1977, the year of Carter's speech. So, according to him, substitution is the rule. Now, do not take me wrong. You will find substitutions in all transitions. Think, for example, of the steam locomotive, which was replaced by electric or diesel locomotives in the 20th century. But if we look at the statistics on the right, again, global energy statistics from 1800 to the present, when you look at these statistics, we can clearly see a different pattern, namely that addition was the defining feature of the development, the addition of new energy sources and thus the expansion of the overall energy use. And unfortunately, most of the added energy sources were fossil ones. So how did this come about? Now, a third step, I will try to illuminate this by taking a brief excursion into theoretical models. I would like to start with this energy flow diagram, showing energy use and consumption in Switzerland in the year 2021. You can see from the left to the right in different colors the energy sources. Some are domestic, some imported. Then in the middle, you see power plants and refineries that process the inputs before they were finally delivered to the different consumer categories on the right. Only hinted at, but you can well imagine, are the huge investments and infrastructures that were necessary to build up this highly complex system. I think the complexity in here also is much reduced, is still visible. And also the investments needed to operate and maintain it. It is therefore helpful if you understand modern energy supply as a large technical system, or as a series of interconnected large technical systems. This view was championed by the historian of technology Thomas Hughes, who used it to analyze electrification at the turn of the 20th century. Like everything else, electrification began on a small scale. First circle in this diagram, above on the left. Then it grew and formed systems, which continued to grow in a systemic way, and which increasingly gained momentum, a trajectory that spurred on further development. You can imagine this large technological system as huge tankers or cargo ships. They are difficult to divert from their course once they have set sail. In such large technical systems, small companies grew into large enterprises. They got linked to certain technologies and resources, invested into machines and infrastructures, but also initiated new rules and laws, lifestyles and habits. Large technical systems, once installed, are difficult to reform or even dismantle. The question therefore arises, how can alternatives emerge alongside such top dogs? In the lower half of the diagram, this question is grappled with the concept of reconfiguration. I don't want to go into this now, but rather use a second model that focuses on precisely this question of change and transition, the so-called multi-level perspective on socio-technical transition, or short, MLP. So this MLP model, and you can see it here in the diagram, operates with 3 levels. It uses a slightly different terminology, but you can imagine the large technological systems at the middle level, which is referred to here as the socio-technical regime. Innovations, according to the model, take place at the lower level in niches. However, these do not initially manage to penetrate the second level, as the prevailing regime is too dominant and keeps these newcomers out. They only succeed in doing so when the dominant regime is destabilized. And this happens by factors located on the third level, which is somewhat unfortunately referred to as the landscape or exogenous context. It's neither landscape nor are these factors really exogenous. But what is meant by this? Let me give you some examples. Think of the 2 world wars or the aforementioned oil price crisis of the 1970s. Or think of the current climate crisis plus Russia's war against Ukraine. And then you add these factors, which are here called exogenous or landscape. If we take the history of renewable energies, we see that they experienced their first upswing in the energy crisis of the 1970s. Jimmy Carter also mentioned them. But they remained in niches and did not make it to the regime level. They only succeeded in doing so in the 2010s, at the beginning of the next phase of destabilization caused by the climate crisis. This brings me back to our current energy transition. We have now learned that there have been a number of energy transitions in the past 200 years, that the main characteristic of this transition was the addition of non-renewable energy sources, most of which, by the way, were also non-local and thus brought with them dependencies. For example, our current natural gas crisis here in Austria can be categorized in such longer series. In our current energy transition, we need to move away from this pattern. Therefore, to answer one of my questions, I do not see our current as just another transition, but rather as the transition that must break through the pattern of the mentioned past 6 transitions. I like to suggest 4 solutions. First one is quite obviously, addition must be replaced by subtraction. And this is something really new, something that has not happened in the past 200 years in such an extent and on a global level. The fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas have to go, as must nuclear energy. And as you know from school, subtraction is more difficult than addition. And unfortunately, this also applies here. We are currently seeing the first attempts to phase out nuclear energy and coal. But as you can see from the 2 maps, the left one is on nuclear, the right one on coal. The extent of these attempts are still completely inadequate. With regard to nuclear energy, the picture is even contradictory. Many countries continue to rely on nuclear energy, others even want to get into it. And these are all the countries in the colors blue and green. And so you see it's a large majority. Renewable energy capacities are currently increasing very rapidly. That's the good news. However, the gap to non-renewable energy sources is huge. So we have seen this on the statistics. And there are basically three ways to close it. Firstly, by substitution. For example, by installing heat pumps instead of gas boilers, something we attempt now in Western or in Europe, especially in Austria, and by which we can reduce both CO2 emissions and dependency. However, substitution will not be enough, and sustainable energies will not become available fast enough. So we need more. So secondly, and this is my third solution, improved efficiency in energy utilization comes into play. And you have also already talked about this as well, yes? And this is nothing new. And the good news is that we can trace efficiency gains back over the last few decades. And you have also talked about this. And so these are have the same results. So this reduction is discussed in terms of falling energy intensity and decoupling. The decoupling of production measured as GDP and energy consumption. And this was different in the 19th century. At that time, energy intensity rose, which means that energy consumption rose faster than GDP rose at those times. And so graphically, this development is represented as an inverted U, as you can see here in both of these graphs. So it first went up, energy intensity, and afterwards, in the last decade, it started to fall. However, there's a problem with efficiency gains, and not an entirely new one, because it has been described by Stanley Jevons, a renowned British economist, back in 1865. In this book, The Coal Question, also using energy as the example. And he described it in the form that is still valid today. Namely, that increasing efficiency can lead to increased energy consumption. What we call the Jevons paradox, or you may have already heard this, the rebound effect. To put it simply, many efficiency gains have been and continue to be cancelled out by increasing energy consumption. And I've listed a few examples from the recent past. So when you look at housing, yes, more efficient houses, but more space per capita is used. Going to consumption, more efficient products, but higher consumption. Traffic, more efficient cars, but more and heavier cars, and more car kilometers per capita are driven. And if you go to industry and services, well, again, more efficient industry and services, but more. And here we have also the question, is this an effect of structural change? That we have here a movement towards services, but the industry is relocated abroad, yeah, to other countries where industry products are cheaper produced, but probably not more energy. So what remains is, thirdly, to consume less energy. That means to save energy, or to use a more recent term, to work towards sufficiency. You may have noticed that Jimmy Carter placed energy saving very prominently in his speech. That's back in 1977. However, his efforts had no lasting effect. At the time, in the mid-1970s, for a short time, energy saving was also omnipresent in Europe. And on the slide, you can see two initiatives from Switzerland and Austria that both are very typical of the time. They are characterized by the fact that saving energy is a private matter. It is no coincidence that campaigns primarily targeted housewives, which makes them, by the way, highly interesting documents for gender history. Now, have you heard of a current energy-saving policy? What is missing today, in my opinion, is indeed a public sufficiency strategy. And unfortunately, I do see hardly any steps in this direction. Most politicians give the issue a wide berth. It is obviously unpopular, and it is not politically rewarding. Now let me come back, and this is my final point, to the issue of justice, which I have started with. In other words, to the question of the current transition will likely be a just one or not. As I mentioned in the beginning, the question of a just transition is curtailed if it is only applied to production. Indeed, consumption must be added. This brings energy poverty into the picture. Energy poverty we can analyze on two levels. On the one hand, at the global level, by comparing CO2 emissions and GDP of countries, as shown in the chart on the left, again by our work in data. Many people in the countries listed on the lower left in the diagram have no or insufficient access to energy sources, such as electricity. This means they are really completely energy poor. We can also define energy poverty on a national level. And according to Statistics Austria, 3% of Austrian households were energy poor in 2019, and thus before the recent price increases. This approximately 115,000 households had a low household income, of which they spent an above average proportion on residential energy. If we now ask about the causes, high energy prices are not at the forefront, as energy prices have been falling, both in the long term and in recent times. So I've brought you two diagrams. So on the one above, you see a long-term price series for so-called energy services that Roger Fouquet has compiled for the United Kingdom. And you can see the trend is not linear, it goes up and down, but the long-term tendency is quite clear. Energy services get cheaper for all of them, lighting especially, but also passenger transport and residential heating. The diagram below, there you can see the average burden of energy and expenditures on Swiss households over the last 20 years. So here the movement is not that clear, but it's also the tendency gets down. So they spend, in average, I have to say, less on energy of their overall income. So not energy costs cause the problem of energy poverty, but low household incomes and the enormous differences in income and also wealth that exist both globally and nationally. In my opinion, this is where we need to stop. I like to end with a few suggestions for further reading. I've listed a few titles, first 4, that I think offer a good introduction into energy history, so I like to read on. And I have supplemented them with some of my own publications below. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward